This is part 4 of chapter 23, the respiratory system. We'll learn about gas exchange. Carbon dioxide diffuses more slowly than oxygen. And we always have a certain normal range for the partial pressure of oxygen and carbon dioxide in blood. For oxygen, the partial pressure is between 40 and 100, and for carbon dioxide is 40 to 45. When we are at rest, we're not doing any exercise, only about 25% of the available oxygen in oxygenated blood will actually enter the tissue cells. But once you start to do any exercise, that means your muscles need more oxygen will be released and delivered to the tissue cells. Let's learn first about the transport of oxygen. In the blood, some oxygen is dissolved in the plasma as a gas. This is around 1.5%, but this is not enough to stay alive. We need much more oxygen. Most oxygen, which is the remaining around 98.5%, is carried attached to hemoglobin. And if we remember this term, oxygenated hemoglobin is called oxyhemoglobin, oxygen plus hemoglobin. This is just a reminder of the structure of the hemoglobin molecule. It consists of 4 globin chains, which are protein chains, 2 alpha and 2 beta, and the heme group, which is a pigment part, a non-protein part, with an iron ion at the center of each heme group that will bind to oxygen. That's why each hemoglobin molecule can carry up to 4 molecules of oxygen only. The amount of hemoglobin saturated with oxygen is called saturated hemoglobin. S comes from saturation, the amount of oxygen saturation of hemoglobin. Each hemoglobin can carry 1, 2, 3, or maximum 4 oxygen molecules. The blood that leaves the lung is a fresh oxygenated blood. So it's fully saturated. It carries the 4 molecules of oxygen. Oxygen saturation at this level is very close to the 100. It's 95 to 98%. When it returns, it already gave away some oxygen to the tissue cells. So if you're at rest, oxygen saturation may be 75%. If we used more oxygen, the oxygen saturation would be much more less. The relationship between the amount of oxygen dissolved in plasma and the saturation of hemoglobin is called the oxygen hemoglobin saturation curve. So with this curve, we are trying to find the relation between hemoglobin and amount of oxygen available in plasma. Let's see this relation. The greater the partial pressure of oxygen dissolved in plasma, the more oxygen will combine with hemoglobin, and the higher the saturation of hemoglobin would be. And this makes sense. Think of it the same way like you're going shopping. The more money you have, the more shopping you can do. It's the same for hemoglobin. The more oxygen available in plasma, the more it can carry and the more the oxygen saturation would be. Let's give examples on this curve. This is the partial pressure of oxygen in millimeters mercury, and this is the percentage of saturation of hemoglobin, the SaO2. First one here is deoxygenated blood in contracting skeletal muscles. We know that in contracting skeletal muscles, we are using much oxygen. Using much oxygen means we don't have enough oxygen bound to hemoglobin. So the oxygen saturation would be around 35%. Second example is deoxygenated blood in systemic veins at rest. Let's see here. This is a resting tissue. This is a not exercising one. So the oxygen saturation here would be much more, around 75%. What about oxygenated blood in systemic arches, like the aorta, for example? Blood in the lungs, coming from the lungs, fresh oxygenated blood. Yes, now we have a high oxygen saturation of hemoglobin, almost 100%. So as I said, the more oxygen available, the more it can combine with hemoglobin and increase the saturation of hemoglobin. How can we measure this oxygen saturation? Now we have the pulse oximeters, and it can be bought anywhere. And we just put it on the index finger to measure the oxygen saturation in just a couple of seconds. We have several factors that determine the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen. How much hemoglobin is attached to oxygen. In the next couple of slides, we'll learn about these different factors and how they affect our oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. Body temperature, blood pH, and the partial pressure of carbon dioxide, all of these factors, they can shift the entire oxygen hemoglobin saturation curve either to the left, and we need to understand these directions. To the left means higher affinity for oxygen, binding oxygen more strongly. Hemoglobin won't be letting go of oxygen easily. While shift to the right means lower affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen, or binding oxygen less strongly, or hemoglobin would be generous enough to give oxygen away. Let's start with the first factor, the effect of body temperature. The contracting skeletal muscles will generate more heat. And this increase in temperature will cause shift to the right. Shift to the right means lower affinity for oxygen. Why? Because it would be easier to release more oxygen from hemoglobin and deliver this oxygen to the active muscles. We know that during exercise, the muscles need more oxygen. So hemoglobin has to be more generous to give away oxygen to these exercising muscles. Now let's go to our curve. This is at normal blood temperature, like 37 degrees centigrade, or in Fahrenheit, 98.6. In high temperature, also in fever, our oxygen hemoglobin saturation curve will shift to the right. To the right means giving away oxygen. While the opposite, in hypothermia, hypo means low, low temperature, this curve will shift to the left, means oxygen is bound very strongly to hemoglobin. Hemoglobin won't give away oxygen. We need to understand the shift to the right and to the left and the effect of fever or hypothermia on the curve. Our next factor is blood pH. pH within muscle cells become more acidic because of the production of lactic acid and carbonic acid from metabolically active tissues, like exercising muscles. When hydrogen ion increases, pH decreases. As we'll learn later in chapter 27, hydrogen and pH has an inverse relation. More pH, more hydrogen ions, low pH, and the opposite. So how hydrogen ions will affect our curve? Some hydrogen ions will bind to hemoglobin. And once it binds to hemoglobin, it will induce a change in the shape of hemoglobin. And hemoglobin cannot carry oxygen the same way, so it will give oxygen away. It will cause shift to the right. Let's see our curve again. This is at normal blood pH, which is around 7.4. In acidosis, which means low pH, which means high hydrogen concentration, the curve will shift to the right, which means oxygen is released. While the opposite, in alkalosis or high blood pH, the curve will shift to the left, which means no oxygen is released, or very little would be released. Hemoglobin will bind oxygen very tightly. Third factor is the effect of partial pressure of carbon dioxide. It has the same effect of hydrogen. All metabolically active tissues, they produce more carbon dioxide as a waste product. So they produce carbon dioxide, they produce acids. All of these happens during exercise. Some of the carbon dioxide will bind to hemoglobin. This will change its shape and will cause shift to the right. So this is normal blood carbon dioxide level. At high blood carbon dioxide, the curve will shift to the right, so more oxygen is released, while at low blood carbon dioxide, it will shift to the left, so hemoglobin will bind oxygen tightly. Do we have any questions? We're good till here?
Good.
Good.
I'm good.
One more example is fetal and maternal hemoglobin. How the fetus gets its oxygen supply, it's from his mother, from the maternal placenta. This is the only way for the fetus to get oxygen to support life without lungs. That's why any oxygen that the fetus gets, it will keep it tightly bound to its hemoglobin. It will not give it away. It's precious. It's hard to get. The fetal hemoglobin has a higher affinity for oxygen than adult hemoglobin. It binds oxygen more strongly. It won't give it away. That's why the fetal hemoglobin, we will see that it will shift the curve to the left. It won't give away oxygen. We learned before about carbon monoxide poisoning, and we said it's produced when gas, wood, charcoal, or other fuel is burned. And this also is another example for the shifting of the hemoglobin saturation curve, because we said once carbon monoxide binds to hemoglobin, it will change its structure, and oxygen and carbon dioxide can no longer be carried. That means it will shift the curve to the left. Oxygen is not released. This is our last slide. It shows us how carbon dioxide is transported in the blood. There are three different forms. Only around 7% is dissolved in plasma as a gas. The majority, 70%, is converted to carbonic acid through the action of an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase enzyme. Remember the name of the enzyme. And this carbonic acid will then dissociate into hydrogen and bicarb. This is a reversible reaction, which means it can go both ways according to our need of hydrogen ions. 23% is attached to hemoglobin. As we mentioned earlier, hemoglobin main job is to carry oxygen, but it also carries 23% of carbon dioxide.